So our session today is all about API maturity and moving from strategy to execution. And I'm delighted to be joined by David Mooter from Forrester. David, want to say hello to everybody?
Hello, glad to be here.
Great. So my name is Frank Kilcommins. I'm Principal API Evangelist here at SmartBear. And myself and David will be taking you through some content, hopefully a mixture of theory and practical tips and tricks that you can bring back into your organizations. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. Today's session is being recorded. Everybody who has registered will receive a copy of the recording for your on-demand viewing pleasure. If you do have questions throughout the session, please do use the Q&A box that's at the bottom or side or top of your Zoom window, and we'll be happy to answer as many of those questions as possible. We might take some of them on the fly throughout today's session, and if not, we will have a dedicated Q&A section at the end of today's session. So what we'll be covering today is David will be taking us through Forrester's three-pillar API enablement model and bringing a lot of experience that he has from the field and working with lots of customers there to showcase how to mature your API strategy in the best way. I'll be following that up with the SmartBear perspective on where we're seeing API maturity, potentially some challenges, and how folks can navigate the increasing complexity that's out there across the API landscape. We'll then introduce API Hub, which is our new SmartBear offering of a holistic suite of tools coming together across a unified experience for delivering APIs. I'll give a high-level demo of that, and then we'll follow up with some Q&A. So just before we get going, a poll is going to pop up on the screen just to gauge where you are in your maturity curve. So feel free to fill out that poll, and with that, I will hand over to you, David, to take us through the first portion.
All right, yeah, thanks for having me. So I'll just get straight into it. Um, so when I have conversations with clients about API programs, trying to make them high-value programs, I notice there seem to be three areas of conversation that I have, and that's where I get the three pillars of a high-value API program for an API enablement model. Now, the programs tend to evolve over time, starting more on developer enablement. How do we create a good developer experience for people creating APIs, internal API consumption, and then ideally evolves more into business enablement. How are we advancing business outcomes? But of course, starting with the developer IT focus first. And as it matures towards that, they tend to focus on, again, those three different areas. And roughly in this order, it's not waterfall. There's a lot of overlap, but tends to be at first you start thinking about the tech stack, the comprehensive API platform. And I believe there are 7 areas of that tech stack that you have to focus on. I won't go through all of them right this moment here. Then as we're building that technical foundation, what does our operating model need to look like? How does it need to evolve and grow as we scale our program? And the key to this is federated delivery. Like as you scale, if it's too much centralized delivery, too much centralized governance, starts to become a very, very common pain point. And then a third one would be business leadership. Do you have the right business involvement, the right business focus with your API programs? So on the theme of trying to go from strategy to execution, you actually want to think about this in reverse. I'm going to walk through this left to right. That, like I said, it tends to be the sequential order people think about as they roll this out. But you want to start with the end in mind. What are the business objectives you're trying to achieve? And then work backwards from there. What is the right operating model we need to support that? What kind of tech investment do we need? So for example, if it's going to be a very externally focused API strategy for customers, partners, as opposed to internal, that may drive differences in things like what kind of developer portal you need, how much you need to invest in lifecycle governance, for example, be some examples of that. All right, so now you've seen the 3 pillars. Let's dig into the first one. I mentioned the tech stack. There are tend to be 7 areas, in my view, of a comprehensive API platform. You could think of them in roughly 3 different groupings. So the first one would be user management, meaning the relationship between the user of the API and the API producer. And 2 key areas for that are the developer portal, which can vary based on if it's internally focused or externally focused. And then also API gateways, and I'd throw in event brokers. I view events as asynchronous APIs. Not every organization goes down that route. Again, like I said, you want to start with what are your business needs. Maybe you don't need events as APIs. Maybe you do for modeling key business events that maybe you want to publish to partners or other departments, lines of businesses, and so forth. And those enforce the contract between the user and the producer. The contract we have for how you can consume this API. A second area would be more of the SDLC concerns: design, documentation, creation of and implementing the API, testing the API, very important concern. And then third area would be cross-cutting concerns that go across the life cycle, like API lifecycle and governance, and also security, which you need to embed security throughout everything. Well, not just APIs, just everything. Everything should be embedded with security when it comes to IT. Now, there are a lot of subcomponents here that you could dig into. What I'm showing here, I know it's a bit of an eye chart, is not to say you need to buy all this, but the point is to, as you think about these 7 areas, for each area, brainstorm what are the specific sorts of things that would be useful for advancing your business outcomes. This is just some examples you could use for brainstorming ideas of what your requirements will be. And I think that really helps drive the technical requirements you need for thinking about vendors and making that purchase decision. So the key point to think about for this is think about a vendor that can be foundational to most of your needs. And you're probably not going to find a vendor that can fill 100% of your needs in these 7 areas, but find one that can fill most of them, and then use specialty vendors to fill in gaps. A very common one for that, especially, would be like security. There's this whole API security market out there that fills a lot of gaps that you don't see with API management and other types of vendors in the API space. Now, there's some areas of the tech stack I wanted to call out, just draw attention to. One is where I think there tend to be, or not where I think there are gaps, where I see gaps. So I did a survey of buyers of API management solutions, and I asked them, what are top 3 product enhancements you're looking for? In other words, what are gaps you see in your tech stack? And the top 3 responses I got, you can see on the screen here. More support for non-REST APIs was the main thing, and that was primarily events and maybe to a lesser extent GraphQL. Number 2 was a more flexible API user portal, and that flexibility again can vary depending on external facing versus internal. External needs to be very flexible because you're marketing your business. It's not just documentation, it's marketing your APIs, your business, your services. Internal, it's more about how do I help my fellow colleagues figure out how the API works and get support from me if they need to reach out to me. And then improve dashboards and analytics for monitoring of APIs was number 3. One area that's a little bit newer in the tech stack is what Forrester calls Turing bots. So these are not unique to APIs. These are AI components that accelerate the software development lifecycle. You can think of like GitHub Copilot would be an example of that, but we're for a more general Turing bot. But we're seeing these more and more in API space. Now, Turing bots, what we've seen, now these stats I'm going to give you are for development in general. It is a bit hard to find data on very specific types of development tasks, but I think these trends would apply for API development. So I say 50% productivity gain for code creation. As for code creation in general, includes APIs, non-APIs. So this is, I have a colleague who focuses heavily on Turing bots. He's done a deep dive into this world, and he's seen up to 50% productivity gains for creating code. Also for testing, 30 to 50% productivity gains in testing. And these are the 2 areas where we see the most value of using AI for accelerating the software development lifecycle, development and testing phases. One concrete example, this is a company, Westpac. They divided 4 different groups. 3 of them were using 3 different Turing bots, and then the control group wasn't using a Turing bot. And they saw a 46% productivity gain. And I think a key point here is that they did not see a reduction in code quality. That can be a concern when you're using these AIs to generate things, whether it's generating tests or code. What is the quality like? Are we sacrificing quality for moving faster? And at least in this case, the answer to that was no, we are not sacrificing quality. Second area, I think, is so the second pillar. So that's kind of all I have to say on the tech stack. We could go on forever on that, as you can see by all the different areas to invest in. But for the second pillar is the operating model. And I mentioned before that centralized delivery, that is a common problem, especially around governance. If you're doing API governance centrally, every project has to go to this team to review their API. It just kills throughput. When you start an API program when you're younger, more immature, it may be centralized. That's usually a good way to start. But you from very early stages, you want to think about, as we grow, how do we move beyond that centralized model, which is aiming for federated delivery, federated governance. Now, when I say federated, I don't so think of the 3 models actually. There's centralized, federated, and decentralized. So centralized is a central team, often called a center of excellence, is owning complete control of governance, maybe even delivering the APIs, publishing them to the gateway, and so forth. Decentralized is you don't have a center of excellence. This is just Wild West free-for-all in the IT organization, which is probably the worst model you can have. The federated model means you still have some central API organization that owns some things, but they try to push out certain tasks to the app developer teams. When you do that, you have 2 key trade-offs you have to address. One is when you federate, you go faster, which is why you federate. That speed is probably the most important concern. I think that's going to become more important as AI takes off. We're going to need more and more APIs for AI to consume. It's going to increase the demand for you to deliver more APIs, so you have to go faster. Well, when you go faster, the trade-off is it's harder to be consistent. If I have a central team reviewing, delivering APIs, they're going to be consistent in how they do that, right? So if we push it out the line of business teams, you become more inconsistent. Can we put things in place to mitigate that issue? The other area that you run into, or the other trade-off you run into, is that when you push things out to line of business IT teams, they make better decisions. They are closer to their business problem. They are closer to their architecture, their tech stack, than a centralized center of excellence is. So they make better decisions, but it is harder to deliver information, to get information flowing across the organization, versus if I'm a central team, I see every project. You come to me for review, I can tell you, yeah, 3, 4 projects have had the same issue. Here's how they dealt with it. Go talk to Joe over there, and so forth. So the reason I wanted to start with this is when I show you the typical model for a federated delivery, it's designed to address these trade-offs, to minimize the pain of the loss of consistency and the difficulty in sharing information. So the operating model typically looks like this. So if in the center, you have 3 boxes that are your core API program. And I'd start with the left, which is what I call the enablement team. I prefer enablement team, center for enablement, rather than center of excellence. They're I think the most important part of an API operating model. They're responsible for creating guidance, governance standards, patterns, and shipping those off to the app dev teams, which you see at the top. For them to then run with. The app dev teams are responsible for complying with the governance standards, enforcing those standards, and so forth. On the right, also part of the core API program is a platform team that collaborates with app dev teams to develop that tech stack I was showing you earlier, that first pillar. How do we make that comprehensive API platform a more automated, more self-service for app dev teams, that they don't have to open a ticket to the API team to publish an API in many cases. And the key there is platform engineering and thinking of the application developers as your customers, and that you're developing the infrastructure for them with that customer mindset. The third one, part of the API program in the middle, is community of practice, not a formal team. It is an informal gathering, oftentimes monthly. Sometimes they see an additional one quarterly that has a broader audience to talk about like huge overarching trends in APIs. But that's a discussion forum of what's going on, learnings from projects and so forth. And then I forgot to mention the bottom left there, when the enablement team is creating their guidance and standards and so forth, is informed by stakeholders like your enterprise architecture team, info security. It's also informed by the community of practice discussions. Very common structure. So why do we have this? How does this address those trade-offs? Well, the information sharing is one trade-off. That's what the community of practice is there for, to help ensure that information is flowing across everyone interested who has a stake in APIs. Then there's the consistency, was the other trade-off. That's why you have the platform team there. Platform team addresses consistency in two ways. One is automated governance. Think of linters, like spectral rules and so forth. And maybe we'll see AI involved in more semantic rule enforcement. I think maybe a trend we see in the coming year or two. But automating that so that even though app dev teams are self-enforcing their governments, you have visibility into it. You can see a report of all APIs that don't comply with certain rules. App dev teams can see if they overlook something because they don't live and breathe governance every day like the old school center of enablement or center of excellence did. Second way is by of getting consistency is by automating the tools you want them to use. Like if you want them to use a certain gateway, a certain portal, a certain testing, API testing tool, if it's easier for the app dev teams to use those tools than not to use them, then they'll be adopted. You don't have to have some stick enforcement where people get bad performance reviews or a manager breathing down their neck because they didn't use a tool. They'll want to use those tools because they are easier to use than not using them. So that is a key motivating force for platform team, is that consistency and enabling self-service without sacrificing the consistency. Like I said, I see this all over the place. I did a case study on Roche Pharmaceuticals. I also wrote a blog about Roche, which you can go look that up. But this is basically what you saw before, but it's kind of turned sideways, and the boxes are rearranged differently. But we still have the same. You know, we have at the top the app dev teams. The right is the community of practice, Center for Enablement, and then they had multiple platform teams because their program was more than just APIs. It included iPaaS, B2B integration, things like that. But it just gives you more details of some of the responsibilities they had on the Center for Enablement and the center. They also had integration champions was a role in the C4E, and those were enablement people, API, integration experts in general, not just APIs, but they would be aligned to a handful of app dev teams to really get to know deeply what are the needs of that app dev team so that the C4E is better delivering services to them. Not every organization has that. Roche is pretty large to have that champion role. So if you're very, very large, I think that's a valuable role to have. Smaller organizations may not need to have that kind of specialization. Some of the results Roche had was 30% savings on procurement migration due to REST, additional 20% due to events. Events added a new channel, 40% faster time to production for APIs. And this kind of touches on a couple of things. I mentioned earlier in the tech stack that going beyond REST was a very common demand that buyers have of their vendors. And Roche very much illustrates that because they embraced events as asynchronous APIs, as co-equals with REST as they started their API program. And then the platform engineering was a big focus as well as part of that federated operating model I described. And having that Center for Enablement help app dev teams become really good at delivering high quality APIs with the right automation tooling from the platform team. And that's what allowed them to do faster time to production. Like the sub bullet there shows They had one tool their platform team developed that saved 1,000 labor hours and 500 days of project duration during 1 year. Also massive scale. That federated delivery, they would not be, so 1,300 API deployments to production in 6 months, 1,600 production APIs, 100 new developers onboarded to the publishing platform. This scale would not be possible with centralized delivery. Like this shows, I think, how much federated delivery can really push an API program. Also, for platform engineering, another example, Ericsson had a platform team where they had a self-service console for API delivery. They were measured on, the platform team was measured on things like reuse, reducing bottlenecks, improving governance compliance. I should also add Roche's platform team was also held accountable for similar kinds of metrics. And Ericsson saw great benefits as well, 30% reduction in time to deliver APIs from request to production, and increased quality through self-service linting and automated workflows. All right, so that's the operating model pillar. Third pillar is business leadership, and the question is, who should lead your API strategy? Should it be the CIO or maybe some other IT leader like the enterprise chief architect or the VP of app dev? And I think the answer to that is no, in most cases. I think it should be the CEO or other business leader. This is backed up by Forrester data. I have a survey where I ask, who leads your API strategy? And the two green boxes on the right, 28%, 24%, those are both business leader options. So the 28% is product management and the 24% is CEO or other business leadership. The blue on the left, 42%, is basically IT, CIO or other IT leader. We got a small 2% wedge for someone else and a 5%. We don't have an API strategy, which I find kind of puzzling. Like I call that the "we're doomed" segment. So if you don't have an API strategy, you're probably doomed, to be blunt. But what's I think is interesting about this is if you add those two business pie wedges, it comes out to be a little bit over 50%. So a little over 50% of respondents indicate a business leader primarily leads API strategy. Unfortunately, I've only asked this for 2 years, so I don't have a lot of trending. I would guess if I asked this 5 years ago that it would not be a majority business leadership. Maybe it would still be probably a large piece of it, but I think it would have been majority IT. And my gut instinct is that the business segment is growing and will continue to grow. Excuse me. This is true across industries. So what I'm showing here is the by verticals, and the green for each vertical is the sum total of those two green wedges, the two business options on the previous slide. The blue in the middle is the IT option, and then the red at the bottom is that we don't have an API strategy. And you can see that this trend is pretty much across all verticals, with one notable outlier, public sector, education, healthcare. Unfortunately, we lumped them together in our the way we do the survey. I would have been interested to see healthcare separated from public sector, because there are some interesting mandates around healthcare for interoperability that I think will be getting business more involved in healthcare, whereas or healthcare APIs, whereas public sector education, I think typically is more of a laggard when it comes to API maturity. So that there may be a interesting distinction there that we're not seeing with how we group it. But nonetheless, I think I can say with confidence public sector education is a laggard. So IT-led tech strategy is thinking of APIs more like glue between applications. Very much focus around CIO setting direction, architects, developers, just gluing your apps together. And there is value here, right? This is much better than the old way of doing apps, like 10, 15 years ago, where apps couldn't communicate with each other and you're doing a bunch of nightly batch cycles on the mainframe. Not great. It's good we move past that. But you get more value out of your APIs if it's more of a CEO-led business strategy, thinking about, and there's still an important architectural role here, but thinking about value stream mapping. And then what are our business capabilities through business architecture to to deliver those value streams. And then those business capabilities and the value streams are those APIs, are we building digital business interfaces? And having product manager's guide that okay, API product manager, not, you don't see it in most organizations as a formal role, but do you have someone in the business who kind of acts like that? Or if not, do you have someone in IT at least who can think like a product manager when it comes to your API design? Those are more common than a formal API product manager role. So when I say API PM there on the top right, it's a little bit more figurative than literal. Now, of course, you do have applications behind these business capabilities, but your architecture is focusing on APIs as business capabilities, and abstracting away the underlying applications. You can think of it as like this: is that your business is in the software. Everything is digital. Either it's in the software as an incoherent, glued together spaghetti mess like the left, or it's in the software expressed through very clean business capabilities that you can assemble or reassemble in new and novel ways. Um, this is much, much higher value. So to give one example, a health insurance provider, they were doing 3 partner integrations per year, and more of a project mindset rather than a product mindset. So every time we get a new partner, IT gets involved, builds new APIs or updates APIs, and turn into this giant spaghetti mess, ugly soap schema. They brought in a product manager and this PM thinking about market needs rather than project, what's in front of my nose needs, was able to identify that 90% of our market can be met with 10% of what we built in the soap. So based on that, we factored into an API that was highly reusable. And then the more niche, obscure use cases were often add-on APIs that 90% of the users could just ignore and not get bogged into. This resulted in 42 partner integrations the next year, from 3 to 42 partner integrations. Then also agricultural retailer did IT-led project-centric approach. Again, 3 to 4 months writing new partner APIs. PM comes in, crafts a single API to meet the target market, and they could reduce onboarding of partners 2 to 3 weeks. So this is the value of having a more business-led API strategy rather than an IT project-led strategy. Another key value of that approach that's hard to quantify monetarily is uncertainty. And when I say hard to quantify, it's kind of like, how do we know we're spending enough on security, or are we spending too much? Well, the only way to answer that with 100% confidence is to get a security breach. And then you know the answer is we didn't spend enough. But it's hard to know exactly where you are because security is uncertain. You don't know what breaches are going to come your way. Well, same thing's true of business strategy. We don't know what kind of pandemics and wars and tech advances like AI that disrupt everything, and trade policy changes and regulatory changes. All this should sound familiar. We don't know what's coming our way. None of the things I listed, they're all familiar now, but they were not something that we could have easily predicted before they happened, going back the past 5 years of disruptions and uncertainty. So every business strategy from your CEO there's some lack of confidence. You can't predict the future perfectly. And so when you're building APIs that represent business capabilities, it allows your business to pivot, to experiment, to try out. Let's take this capability and try it in a new way and learn from that and see what happens. That's the value. So the point there is that business-led API using business capabilities has higher level of value where there is higher level of uncertainty. And the pitch to make here is think about 2 businesses that go to market at the same speed as a 12-month product life cycle. But company A ran twice as many experiments because they have these business APIs that business can easily assemble and try out new ideas with. So company A did twice as many experiments as company B due to that API architecture. Which company is going to be more likely to have a product that lands and is really hits customer needs? Well, it's company A. So that's where the value of optionality increases with uncertainty. It helps you address uncertainty, like in this case, uncertainty of who's going to respond, how are people going to respond to our products. Very, very valuable. And so it's not that, if we go back to the previous slide, well, okay, I guess it's a couple slides ago. Anyway, the slide where I had the spaghetti mess on the left and the business capabilities on the right. it's not that you only do business capabilities. There's trade-offs where you have things are more rigid, like maybe an API for provisioning infrastructure on Git. Well, you can be pretty confident you're going to be doing that the same way 5, 10 years from now. Maybe that can be more rigid. But where there's more uncertainty, that's where you want to invest in more of a business focus. And you get more value out of that. So an example of addressing uncertainty is that these business capability APIs have been used in automation. That's not new. So that's digital process automation, low-code applications, integration platform as a service, robotic process automation. That's the acronym letter soup at the top there. Well, now AI is coming along. Agentic AI. That's kind of the big hot topic for 2025. Organizations that have this kind of business-led API architecture already in place are having an easier time executing on AI agents than those that do not. We didn't predict ChatGPT, but if you have this architecture in place, you're in a better position to respond to this thing that was unpredictable. I also wanted to talk a little bit about maturity. Maybe maturity is the wrong word. The focus of your APIs. So Forrester has a model for high performance IT. Won't go too deep into, but we have 4 different styles. It depends on the speed of change that IT needs to address and the scale of change IT needs to address. And the reason the arrows go in both directions is that we don't want to imply you want to be in the top right. Right? Like I actually saw a speaker at a conference where he said, yeah, this maturity model, and it ends in you're charging people to use your APIs. And he says, everyone needs to go there. That's the goal for everyone. And I'm like, no, that's not the goal for everyone. Especially, government agencies. Do you want the Social Security Administration or a charity, a nonprofit? That makes no sense. So the point is that as the speed of change increases, IT, including APIs, need to become more closely embedded in product delivery. As speed of change is less, you need to be less focused on that. As the scale of change increases, then it becomes more about optimizations across multiple lines of businesses and so forth. Now, for APIs, I think the vertical line is like the left-right split is I think the more interesting one. As organizations have a high speed of change in their products and what they're delivering to market, APIs become more important for an external focus. Whereas ones where it's lower, especially like public sector, education, to kind of pick on them again, APIs need to be much more inwardly focused. Maybe just creating an IT foundation that is just highly resilient, which would be more the enabling style, or APIs that give you visibility into all of your operations so that you can optimize your internal processes, which would be more the top left. I tend to find, go back to what I said at the very beginning, start with the end in mind. What are your business outcomes, and then work backwards. I tend to find this is a very common starting point when you think about business outcomes. Are we more on the right side of this or the left side? And that tends to have big impact on your operating model. If you're on the right, you're going to be delivering a lot more APIs, more urgency to federate more. If you're on the left, maybe less urgency to federate. And also the tech stack. If you're on the right, more externally facing API portals. On the left, maybe more internally facing. And other examples I could give. But anyway, just to wrap it up, again, this is the kind of give you the visual of the model I just walked you through. Hopefully this makes a bit more sense now. The tech stack, operating model, business leadership. And then kind of some final thoughts before I hand it over to my host. My recommendations, again, start with the end in mind. Map out key business objectives and how tech can support them. Identify the API tech stack gaps you need to fill those objectives. Maybe you already have a tech stack in place, but maybe it has gaps. Maybe your business objectives have changed and it no longer meets those, or maybe you're starting from scratch and you're just getting started. Focus on developer enablement first. As you move into execution. Iteratively establish the right tech stack across the 7 areas I mentioned, and then mature the operating model to federated delivery and platform engineering to the degree that you need. Like I gave the Roche example, they're massive. Maybe you don't need to go quite as far as they did, but you definitely need to move to some extent in that direction. And then third, mature towards business innovation. build APIs as business capabilities, not technical glue, and have a product mindset for API design, whether it's a formal API product manager in the business or an API owner in IT who at least thinks like a product manager. So at this point, that's my piece. I will hand it over to Frank and talk a little bit more about SmartBear.
Great. Thanks very much, David. So lots of pearls of wisdom there with regards to some examples and some strategies for thinking about how to really execute upon API maturity and moving from strategy into execution. And we have a lot of similar conversations, of course, with our customer base as well. And really, what we also try to instill is help organizations to recognize those business drivers that can benefit from having a more mature approach to APIs. So again, if you're identifying scenarios or you have a desire to move and reach out into new customers or markets, especially if they're not proprietary applications and technologies that you own. So if you're going to be integrating into other marketplaces, then APIs are the best conduit for that. You might also have desires to just improve your overall customer experience or your net promoter score. You have a desire to be able to support and offer omni-channel. So again, maybe not everything is being offered through mobile apps. You might have a mixture of mobile apps, web portals, and again, partner integrations or participating in other marketplaces like embedded finance, for example. And you also want to be multi-consumer. So traditionally, we would have been making our API capabilities available to human developers, but as David also alluded to, agents are now becoming an aggressive consumer of our APIs as well. And when you talk and think about optionality, as David also mentioned, again, you want to be able to be adaptable for those changing market conditions. And if you do so in the right way, and it mightn't be a fit for all scenarios, you can identify opportunities for direct revenue through APIs as well. It also really helps with regard to product stickiness. So again, if you have a SaaS application or a portal application that are being used by your customers, if you also offer API capabilities for those fundamental capabilities that are being offered, you have an ability for your customers to integrate into those capabilities from their CI/CD practices. And ultimately that makes you have a more sticky experience and bringing value to customers across different forms of interaction. Now, others are dragged kicking and screaming into the API process from a regulatory perspective, but that's also fine. That can be a very, very good way to make sure that you are ticking off all of those regulatory requirements and you're also keeping a very sharp eye on any security requirements that you have. And that can be industry specific, but it's often good to have a good framing and perspective on that as well. And again, when you think about optionality and thinking about how you want to manage your business domains, understanding the capabilities that you have, representing them cleanly, so moving away from that spaghetti type of scenario that David showed in one of his slides, and really having a layered approach to the capabilities that you have and understanding the interactions across those capabilities inside the walls of your org, but also outside. And of course, we're all preparing for AI readiness. So we've had to the traditional scenarios for the last 10 or more years of having B2B integrations, B2C integrations, but now also B2A or business to agent consumption is becoming more relevant as well. And it's not only organizational drivers, of course, it's also operational and tech drivers. So you might be doing architectural shifts within your org, moving into that more composable model and not having to start every delivery greenfield. So again, layering and building value by comprising and composing capabilities together, and also removing the domain complexity that you have in your org. So not letting domain specifics or taxonomy bleed into what you're exposing outside of the boundary of your domains. And that can really keep you focused on having an appreciation for the qualitative properties of APIs and ensuring that you can do your best to address those earlier in the process and consider other non-functional requirements, be that usability, be it scalability, security, and so forth. And what I've experienced in many interactions with customers is that one of the big pain points, if there's a very much a project focus, is that integration projects have a nasty habit of running over or not meeting the success criteria. So if again you have a real focus on improving your API maturity, you can really address integration project success head on. Other things that are kind of byproducts of that is you remove silos. So you have better ways of collaborating across teams and speeding up the onboarding of internal developers onto teams, but also external developers into being able to consume and interact with your APIs as well. And that leads to a better developer experience. And it can't be underestimated the value that that has or the impact that that can have also on you as a company from a reputation perspective, from a brand perspective, when you are participating in a pretty aggressive market. And if you do this pretty well and you have your domains separated nicely and you understand where those boundaries are, it really allows you to be in control of those cross-domain communications. And that's especially important as you start exposing capabilities out into the market. And what I would always say is an API is probably the longest living piece of tech that we will ever create. The actual implementation behind that interface can come and go, and a consumer should not really care about the implementation detail as long as the interface contract remains consistent. So it gives you a really good and valuable attack surface when it comes to wanting to tackle technology debt, as long as you can uphold that promise that you're making to your consumer. So these are some of the things that we try to help organizations realize, and that's especially important when you look at some of the macro items that are happening across the API landscape. So I think David also alluded to it, but we're creating more APIs than ever. So 93% of businesses are now using APIs in some shape or form. So the majority of us are digital companies, irrespective of the industry that we participate in. And the global API economy is really surging. And that's been fueled also by AI, of course. And what we've seen in 2024 is that the production of APIs related to AI has increased by 800%. And what we're seeing is that that is in turn adding 73% of traffic that's happening from an API consumption perspective is actually being generated by AI related consumers. Now, with the production of more APIs, it doesn't exactly make our life easier. And I know there was a question coming in around dealing with API sprawl. And this is something that we're all kind of toying with the challenge. But of course, when we have more APIs, then we're inevitably increasing the complexity in some shape or form for the providers of those APIs. So we're dealing with multi-everything. So many companies are dealing with multiple gateways, multiple portals, be that external facing or internal facing, multiple styles of APIs, of course, because it's not a one style fits all. You will have HTTP or REST oriented APIs, event driven APIs, query based APIs, and there'll be different workflows at play within the teams. There's more specifications also coming out into the API world. So there's different versions of Open API. We also have new specifications like Arazo. We have other protocols that are bridging between AI and APIs like MCP and A2A and all of these additional flavors. Our working structures as organizations is also becoming more distributed. So are we able to ensure that we're delivering APIs consistently as that API portfolio that we have is increasing? And as well, let's not forget that there's more API consumers entering the market. So it's not alone just human consumers anymore. We now also have to be able to cater for agentic experiences, and that's putting additional burden and additional requirements on us. Now, when we have more APIs, we have increased complexity, and that also makes discoverability of the right API that we want to consume a little bit more difficult. So we're losing the ability to have a universal mechanism for discovering APIs irrespective of their style. If we can't discover APIs, it makes it harder for us to be able to validate if the quality of the APIs is meeting the standards that we are instilling within an organization. And it's difficult for us to evolve those APIs safely. If we can't discover APIs, it's very hard to then in turn know who are the consumers of APIs. And that means any change that you make potentially might have a breaking impact on a production system. We're also struggling with the ability to be able to add the relevant semantics into API documentation to make it more discoverable by agents. And again, if you can't discover your APIs, then you can't manage your APIs, and ultimately it means you can't protect your APIs. So we're seeing the rise in zombie APIs, and that will inevitably cause security breaches moving forward. And security is, of course, a hot topic and becoming a topic that everybody has to consider, especially as we are becoming more digital in everything that we're doing. And some stats here are maybe a little bit shocking to a certain degree, but 51% of production APIs that are out there do not enforce any form of authentication, not even basic auth. So that's quite a concern in general, especially when you marry that with the fact that 30% of API traffic over the last year has been generated by malicious bots. So these are automations or bots that are just looking for vulnerabilities in the surface areas that we're exposing. And 60% of organizations have suffered API breaches in at least the last 2 years. So again, just keeping all of that in mind, as well as the drivers, we also need to be aware that the technical landscape around us is getting more complex, and we need to be able to pick the right tooling and the right approaches to be able to solve some of these problems. And David also alluded to the mixture between, putting our focus on external APIs or putting our focus on internal APIs. And it really does depend to a certain degree as to what industry you're in. But what I would say is that what we also encounter when we're consulting with and dealing with many of our customers is that unfortunately a lot of the focus goes into just the smaller subset of APIs that are externally facing. But inevitably, the majority of APIs that we produce as a company will be internal orientated. So we need to make sure that we do not forget about them, that we also include those in our maturity cycles as well, and making sure that we govern them appropriately. Now, what we generally try to do is we try to help customers move from having a vision into being able to deliver good APIs that will return value for the API consumers. So, is the vision clearly understood? Is there clarity on what the goal of the future state is? Is that owned appropriately by the business stakeholders? Will the distributed teams that are within a company, will they understand why they're building APIs? Will they have the means, the tooling, and the processes to be able to build good APIs? And will they be able to build those good APIs consistently if they are distributed and federated? Will it be easy then from a consumer perspective, be it internal or external, to find and use those APIs? And again, remember that not all consumers will be human consumers. And then when we really get to think about this repeatable program that we'll execute, do we have the processes in place? Will those processes scale over time? And will we be measuring appropriately how we're doing and refining and improving over time? So it doesn't really matter if you're starting from a centralized model, but ultimately what you should be trying to do is, as David alluded to in his slides, making sure that you have the ability there, be it from a Center for Enablement, an API guild or community of practice, that you can move towards a federated model and you're providing the standards and the toolings for teams to carve out their own success. Now, measuring what matters, I think, really does matter from an executive perspective and from a team perspective. How are we doing from an API maturity perspective? And I think you should be able to find metrics and KPIs that relate back to the drivers as to why you're doing this in the first place. So you should be able to instill and pick the appropriate metrics to measure to determine how you're doing. Are they consumption based? Are they efficiency based, for example? So are you going to make cost savings or reduce the amount of manual work and processes that are there from the teams that will improve the velocity over time? Are you avoiding cost if it comes to failed deployments or bugs getting into production? Have you a way perhaps to use something like DORA metrics to determine how good you're doing from that perspective? And what I would say from a maturity standpoint, you don't want to measure too much, but you want to refine at least semi-annually what you're actually measuring. And what you're measuring should also mature over time, because as you get further along the maturity curve, then what actually is determining if you're successful or not successful will change. So don't be afraid to reconfigure and tweak those levers from a KPI and measurement perspective over time. And this is what we do with a lot of our customers. We help them try to understand what this is, and we work on being able to give them a maturity scorecard periodically over time to help them keep on the right track with respect to their execution. And one, of course, what we offer from a SmartBear perspective is we offer our API Hub, which will, act as one of the many capabilities that will be there as part of their API platform to help them deliver high quality APIs and help them to mature. And what I'll do now is briefly give you an introduction to what API Hub is. So really it's a coming together of the popular capabilities that we would have had across Swagger Hub, Packflow, or Swagger Hub Explore and Swagger Hub Developer Portal tools. And they're all coming together under a unified experience, which will integrate with the other procurements that exist within your platform model. So it'll integrate with all of the different gateways, for example. So now we have different capabilities around design. So are you designing an API to solve the particular problem and do so in a way that will then open that up to be tested? So from a contract testing perspective, are you ensuring that you can evolve your API safely over time? Are you offering the try it out capabilities and the exploration capabilities for consumers to get up and running with your APIs very, very quickly? And then are you having also the appropriate functional test coverage? Once all of those things are then delivered, can you productize and make the API available in a way that will be very, very easy to consume and understand? And when we look at the capabilities that are spread across these different features, how we approach this from a SmartBear perspective is we very much build on top of open standards. So we are big proponents and advocates for specifications like Open API, Async API, JSON schema, and then around that we wrap our open core capabilities. So some of the best open source capabilities that are out there, like Swagger, like Spectral, that David also mentioned from a linting perspective, Pact from a contract testing perspective, Prism for mocking, and then of course bringing that API definition to life in either Swagger UI or Stoplight elements. Then we have our enterprise capabilities that wrap around that. So from standardized governance, integrations with gateways, source control management systems, giving you a unified catalog. So again, irrespective of the style of API, be it event-driven, be it HTTP-based, having the affordance that you can catalog and govern all of these APIs in the same place and then make them available through our portal. Then, of course, this all progressively enhances and scales as you add on enterprise capabilities. So you get support, SSO, user management, insights, and that's integrating with our Insight Hub as well. So I know we have only a few minutes left. So what I'll do is I'll give a very, very brief kind of walk through some of these capabilities so we can move from slides more into something a little bit more interactive. So I just need to reshare my desktop. Here we go. So this is API Hub. So
Frank,
within,
we're seeing your presenter view of the slides.
oh, okay. Pardon me. Choose the right desktop and this should be better. Okay,
Good to
great.
go.
Thanks very much. Sorry about that. So here we have API Hub. So this is the landing page. So we can see the Hub features across design for everything that you need to do with regards to designing and standardizing that API, making it ready for consumption. We then have our portal offering for productizing the API, exploration for interacting with the API. So it's very much like a API client, an ability to then run tests across the API that are in the design catalog, and then ultimately moving on to contract testing from a graceful evolution perspective. So if we jump into the design mode, we have different ways of crafting and curating design. So we have your IDE-based editor, so Swagger editor, which everybody is very comfortable with, I think. We've low-code form editor options if you don't want to interact with YAML or JSON. And we also have an ability to generate APIs using generative AI capabilities with our Halo AI offering. So you can give it a prompt with respect to, I want to create an API to solve a particular problem. It will take the governance standards that you've configured within your API hub, and it will use that to generate the best possible first pass at that API, keeping your standards in mind and kind of giving you an API that should already lint in conformance with those APIs. You then have your catalog, of course. So this is listing the different APIs that I have, irrespective of they being asynchronous APIs or HTTP-based APIs. And you can organize your APIs based on different domains or different projects or teams or departments, whatever works best for you. If you drill into the API, of course, this will be a common experience. So you can edit, as I mentioned, in your IDE-based editor. You have the form-based editor, which is a low-code approach. So you don't have to be proficient in OpenAPI or YAML or JSON, and you can have a form-based editing experience. And if relevant, you can also have your generative AI capabilities as well, where you have your ability to issue prompts and make changes to APIs or design a new API from scratch in more of a chat interface as well. And I think we'll share more in-depth videos behind the scenes so that folks can really kind of see this coming to life. So then if I go back into the landing page again for my design, or maybe just before I do that, I'll take you into the organizational settings. So within the organizational settings, you can set up all of the standards with respect to what a good API looks like for you. And once you specify all those, you could potentially use another style guide, so a public style guide if you wanted to have something like an OWASP top 10 rule set accompany your own let's say organizational specific rule set, so you can kind of shift left a little bit from a security perspective. Once all of that is set up, and what you might have seen when I was within one of my particular APIs, which I'll just get back into this payees API, is that you will see that I'm being told that I have some issues with my API from a governance perspective. So this allows you as a designer, of course, to address all of these things on the fly as you're editing and make sure that you can either enforce these or not before you make the API available for other colleagues that you might have from a testing perspective or a development perspective. What you can also do is from the point in design, because we have contract testing capabilities, is that you can determine if an API or if a change to an API is going to break any of your consumers. So if I check compatibility with this API, we can see it's compatible. So that means it's compatible with all known consumers of this API. If I looked into, this is the contract testing offering. If I looked into the contract testing offering here, and I looked at my payee provider, then I would also be able to see what applications are depending upon this API. And I can see that we have a SmartBear coin payments UI that's depending upon this API. I can see that we're still compatible. I can view what expectations this consumer has of my API. So I can look at the consumer contract and I can see down to a field level what they're expecting to be delivered by an API. That's very, very important, because if I was to go into the design mode and if I was to, for example, make a test, so in this, or make a change, should I say, so in this particular API, I've removed a field, and if I was to recheck compatibility, I find out immediately at that point in design that I'm going to break a downstream consumer. So I don't have to make any code change. I don't have to deploy the API to anybody, and I can see down to a detail level exactly what dependency or what expectation that consumer has upon this API. So that's incredibly powerful to be able to surface that information right at the point of design. So then if I just jump back and go into my developer portal, this will take me into the administration of the portal offering. I can look at a live view of the portal, and here I can see here's my SmartBear coin portal that's exposing my payments API towards my consumers. I can drill into the Payments API, I can get all of the documentation, so I can craft Markdown or HTML pages to accompany my design and basically walk somebody through the steps of integrating this API as quickly as possible, as well as interact with the actual Open API description as well. And again, I can toggle whether that will be in an Elements view or in a Swagger UI view. It's down to whatever works best for the consumer. And then, of course, not to forget testing. And I know we're very much up on time, but from a test perspective, we have the ability to make sure that we have functional tests covering all aspects of the API. So here I have my Payees API. I have it covered with a few test cases, and I can see that based on the last changes that we made, that these tests are passing as would be expected. And again, I have the ability to run these tests locally. So as a developer, if I'm making changes to the API, I can run the test suites locally before I deploy the API or commit it into my Git repository to make sure that all tests are passing as expected. So that's a pretty whirlwind tour through API Hub. And in the last slide or two, let me just bring that up. I've mapped out how API Hub basically fits into the three-pillar enablement model that David was showcasing. So we have developer enablement capabilities that will fit into your existing investments in a gateway agnostic manner. We're offering strong federated governance approaches for C4E or platform teams, and again, across whatever workflow and experience they like. So if they like interacting with the user interface, or they prefer CLI or API integrations with their CI/CD flows, or indeed they want to work in a more IDE orientated experience, we will meet them where they are. And ultimately, this will unlock the ability for the business themselves to discover the capabilities that they're making available and have a more composable model. And there's a few last slides that just talk about mapping this out to the comprehensive API platform. And again, we don't proclaim to have everything there. We have quite a lot of capabilities. Some of them are AI enabled, so around testing, developer portal, standards and governance. And we have partial implementations from a security, gateway integrations, and coding, code first approaches. So that's pretty much it from us. I know we're over time, so what we will do is move to Q&A. If anyone wants to hang on for the Q&A, we'd be happy to answer a few. So let me just see what's in the Q&A, David, and I can put some questions to you. So the first question that was there is about AI agents and how is the proliferation of AI agents going to bring new requirements for API platforms, and basically what can we do to move sensibly in this direction?
Yeah, you actually touched on this earlier about the semantics to describe an API to an AI agent. We have Open API spec, but that was meant for humans, not for AI. And also most organizations, well, I don't have data to prove this, but my instinct is most organizations have very poor or no documentation of their APIs. And I think we need, I love what you said about open standards. I think we need a new open standard, or maybe a revision of Open API spec to have fields for AI. And like right now in Agentforce, for example, they use extension Agentforce specific attributes in the Open API spec file to give semantics to their agents. Like, it reminds me of back in the battle days where you'd write HTML for Internet Explorer and a separate HTML for Netscape, right? Like, we don't want that. We want one standard to describe semantics to all the agents. The other one that is a little harder for me to speak to because it's security. I have another analyst at Forrester covers API security, but I've been reading some interesting things about like the Open API spec. If we use it for semantic descriptions, it could actually become an attack threat. If you corrupt an Open API spec file and it's being fed to like an MCP server or something and consumed by an LLM, now that there could be bad instructions in there that a hacker gets in your Open API spec. So new attack vectors that are really interesting and honestly really frightening that the industry needs to get its arms around.
Absolutely. No, I agree. It's one of the anti-patterns that I'm also seeing as well. I'm kind of referring to it jokingly as backend for LLM or backend for agent consumer. And we don't necessarily want to get into that scenario where it's a different implementation for every type of offering that's let's say on the consumer side. We want to make sure that we can build what we're doing on top of standards, and then that just makes it more interoperable and gives us an ability to be more assured with regards to the steps that we're taking from a provider perspective. I have one more question, which I think we will have time for one more. People seem to be hanging on, so really appreciate that. So, the next question is more around API models and how do API models for events versus regular features work differently? How do we access the current efficiency we have from a business and developer perspective and improve it? So, I guess that means, is there a way for us to build on top of the experiences that we have from a HTTP REST perspective and then apply that also more into the async world?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand that question entirely, but in terms of events versus REST, I think there's oftentimes a duality. Like if a REST endpoint is saying do something, and maybe that do something is give me data, go find some data, give it to me. Whereas an event is saying something just happened. So if I say go do something and it does it, that generates an event. So when you think about business processes, for example, um, everything you do in a business process, there is an event that comes after it. Now, maybe it's not an interesting event, so maybe you don't publish it, but like place stock trade, maybe as an API if I'm a financial institution, eventually that trade executes or it expires unfulfilled. So just having a place trade and order history API, it feels kind of incomplete, right? Unless you have events that come with it. So
Mhm.
um, um, and modeling those are different because they're fundamentally different things, and the technology is different. That's why we have async API as a spec different from Open API spec. They're just different needs when you're talking about asynchrony and message brokers versus a synchronous REST endpoint.
Yeah, true. But there will be scenarios where maybe the structure of the messages will be uniform, irrespective of the style. So, there are abilities to be able to do that. So you can separate your information schema. So the beauty about async API specification and Open API is that they both leverage JSON schema. So you
Mhm.
can isolate your schemas, craft those in JSON schema, and then you can reference those from either Open API descriptions or async API documents as well. So it gives you a little bit more kind of composability and reusability there from an API authoring and governance perspective as well.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point on treating events like APIs is in some cases they're not that different for the way you just touched on there. And you want to um, take what your best practices for REST and as where they are applicable to events like that, also linters, right? Can you do special
Mhm.
or async
Yep.
API, apply those to your events as well, is I think the key theme there.
Yes, and I think the simple answer is you can and you should, and you should exactly treat these with the same amount of scrutiny, irrespective of the API style. There's one last question in the Q&A which I'll attempt to answer. So it's around the compatibility check from a contract testing perspective that I briefly showed in the demo. And basically the question is, how can I handle a case in which we have to deploy a breaking change for whatever reason? Technically speaking, we can do it if we have two versions deployed in parallel, but is there a way for us to handle this more aggressively? So with contract testing, it of course can manage the different or be aware of the different versions of the provider and the consumer and what's changing between those different versions. So it holds all of that information in its matrix of information, and it can answer a question as part of that compatibility check if something is going to break or not break. The beauty about it is not always stopping you from delivering breaking changes. Of course, the whole mantra is that sometimes you have to deliver breaking changes. And if you have 20 API consumers, then it will give you the insight that perhaps only two of those consumers are impacted by that breaking change. So not all 18. And there can be a strong ROI to persist a single version of the API rather than create a new major version just for the sake of those two clients. So it can give you exactly the info as to who's impacted, what the impact is, And what we often see as being a practical workaround or practical approach to dealing with this situation that Esteban asked is there'll be an expand and contract pattern perhaps with those two clients. So you will work together to make sure that you can make that change to the API. You will for a period of time within your API implementation, handle the two scenarios until you work with those two clients to be able to adopt to the new version of the API, and then you can contract back to the new API version or surface area of the API as well. So that's typically what we will see in that type of scenario. So I think that is it, David. We ran 10 minutes over, so apologies to everyone and thanks to everyone who stuck on in there with us. What's on the screen there is just some additional tips that we have from maturity perspective. Other polls probably popped up behind the scenes as well. So thanks to everyone who's been participating in them. And David, I just want to say a big thank you to you as well for sharing all of your knowledge and information with us and the audience here today.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.